The storm arrived just before sunset. Snow hammered against the windows of Elias Turner's workshop hard enough rattling the old glass, while freezing wind screamed through the narrow mountain streets outside. Most of the village already shut their doors for the night, smoke curling heavily from chimneys as families crowded around warm fires waiting for winter weather passing safely by morning. Elias stayed working. The lonely carpenter usually did. Interesting thing about empty houses. Silence felt worse once you stopped moving inside them. So the old craftsman remained beside his workbench, shaping chair legs beneath lantern light, while sawdust drifted softly across worn wooden floors around him. Then someone knocked on the workshop door. Not loud. Weak. Like whoever stood outside barely had strength left trying again. The carpenter frowned immediately. Nobody visited during storms this bad unless desperate. Elias crossed toward the entrance slowly before shoving the heavy wooden door open against the wind. And froze. Two children stood outside in the snow. Orc boys. God above. The older one couldn't have been older than 16. Tall for his age, but painfully thin beneath soaked travel clothes, while snow clung heavily to dark hair, falling across exhausted green skin. One arm remained protectively wrapped around the smaller boy beside him despite visibly shaking from cold. The younger child looked maybe 8. Terrified. Both boys wore torn boots, barely holding together against the snow. Interesting thing about starving children. You noticed it first in the eyes. The older brother stepped slightly in front of the younger one immediately after the door opened. Protective instinct. Automatic. We'll work for food, he said quickly. His voice sounded rough from cold and exhaustion both. We can chop wood. Clean. Carry supplies. The younger boy stared toward the ground, silently clutching his brother's sleeve tightly in frozen fingers. God. Elias noticed bruises on both children immediately. Not accidental ones either. The carpenter leaned one shoulder against the doorway, quietly studying them, while snowstorms raged behind the boys through the dark village streets. Where are your parents? The older brother's expression hardened instantly. Interesting. Not anger. Pain. Gone. One word. Still enough answering everything. The younger child trembled harder beside him, while trying unsuccessfully hiding a cough against his brother's shoulder. Jesus. They'd freeze before morning out here. The older boy noticed Elias looking toward the smaller child and quickly straightened despite obvious exhaustion. We don't need charity. God above. The sentence nearly broke something inside the carpenter's chest. Not because the boy sounded rude. Because he sounded ashamed already. Like kindness always arrived carrying conditions afterward. Elias glanced toward the storm behind them again. Then toward the little brother's blue-tinted fingers gripping soaked, sleeves too tightly from cold. Interesting thing about decent people. Sometimes the choice wasn't really a choice at all. The carpenter stepped aside from the doorway. Come inside before you freeze. Both boys froze. Not relief. Shock. Like the possibility someone might actually help them genuinely surprised them. The older brother immediately shook his head once though. We said we'd work. And I said come inside. Silence stretched heavily beneath the storm winds outside. Then the younger child tugged weakly on his brother's sleeve, whispering something too soft Elias couldn't hear. The older boy swallowed hard afterward before finally leading the smaller child cautiously into the workshop. Interesting. Neither looked toward the furniture, or the tools, or the warmth. They looked toward exits first. God. The carpenter closed the door firmly behind them, shutting out the storm, while furnace heat slowly wrapped around the frozen little workshop again. The younger boy nearly collapsed beside the fire instantly once warmth hit him properly. The older brother caught him before he fully fell. Protective. Always protective. Elias crossed quietly toward the kitchen corner, gathering bread and leftover stew from earlier dinner preparations. The moment food appeared, both boys went perfectly still. Interesting thing about hungry children. Real food frightened them sometimes because losing it hurt worse afterward. The carpenter set the bowls carefully beside the furnace. You can eat first, he muttered. Work tomorrow. The older brother stared at the food silently for several long seconds, then looked toward Elias with visible suspicion. What do you want in return? God above. The question hollowed the room completely, because the boy asked it seriously. Like adults never gave kindness freely in the world he survived. Elias looked toward the two freezing, frightened orc brothers standing inside his warm little workshop while winter storms buried the village outside beneath snow and darkness. then quietly answered, "Nothing." The younger boy began crying immediately afterward. Silent tears. The kind children learned hiding because making noise usually caused trouble. And watching the older brother pull the smaller child closer beside the fire while still looking prepared, fighting anyone who threatened him, Elias Turner realized one painful truth completely. Whatever those boys escaped from, it taught them surviving mattered more than trusting anyone ever again. Elias realized the older brother stayed awake on the third night. The carpenter descended quietly toward the workshop before sunrise, expecting only dying furnace embers and winter silence. Instead, he found the older orc boy sitting beside the front door holding a wood axe across his lap. Wide awake. Interesting. Not tired awake either. Guarding awake. Snow drifted softly beyond the frosted windows, while pale blue dawn barely touched the village outside. The workshop remained silent except for crackling firewood and the younger child's quiet breathing from the small cot near the furnace where he still slept wrapped tightly beneath blankets. The older brother looked up instantly when Elias entered. One hand tightened around the axe handle automatically. God above. The reaction happened too fast for conscious thought. Survival instinct. The carpenter leaned against the staircase quietly. "You planning murdering firewood?" The boy blinked once, then lowered the axe, slightly looking embarrassed afterward. Interesting thing about frightened kids. They often mistook safety for carelessness. "You should sleep," Elias muttered. The older boy glanced immediately toward the younger child beside the furnace instead, then quietly answered, "I do. Lie." The carpenter noticed dark circles beneath his eyes already deepening despite only staying 3 nights inside the workshop. "You haven't slept properly once since arriving." Silence stretched. Then the boy shrugged stiffly. "Not tired." Another lie. "God." Elias crossed toward the furnace, adding another log carefully to the fire while warm sparks drifted upward through the dim workshop. "You got a name?" The older boy hesitated visibly. Interesting. Like names still carried danger. Finally, "Kale." The carpenter nodded slowly toward the sleeping younger child. "And him?" The older brother's expression softened instantly. Small change. Still enough noticing. "Milo." God above. The warmth inside his voice, saying the little boy's name, nearly hurt hearing. Protective older siblings always sounded like that. Like love became responsibility too early. Elias poured hot tea quietly into old clay cups while snow whispered against the workshop walls outside. "How long you been on the road?" Kale froze. Then carefully. "A while." Not answer enough. Still, the carpenter let it go for now. Interesting thing about wounded people. Push too hard, and they vanished emotionally before physically. The younger child stirred softly beside the furnace cot, then coughed hard enough, making Kale instantly abandon the tea and cross the room in seconds. Fast. Panicked. God. The older brother knelt beside Milo, immediately checking his forehead with shaking hands while the smaller boy blinked awake, slowly, through fever-heavy eyes. "It's all right," Kale whispered quickly. "I'm here." Interesting. Not comforting words. Promise. Like the child feared waking alone more than sickness itself. Milo relaxed only after physically touching his brother's sleeve. "Jesus." Elias looked away briefly, pretending to adjust the firewood, while something heavy settled quietly in his chest. The younger boy noticed him moments later and immediately straightened nervously beneath the blankets. "Sorry," Milo whispered hoarsely. God above. Another one apologizing for existing. Wonderful. Elias crouched beside the cot carefully. "You're sick. Stop apologizing." Milo looked confused by the sentence. Like adults usually demanded apologies before kindness arrived. The carpenter hated how unsurprised he felt by that. Later that afternoon, Elias left briefly for supply deliveries across the village. When he returned near sunset, he found the workshop spotless. Firewood stacked perfectly, floors swept, broken chair legs repaired surprisingly well for someone obviously self-taught. Interesting. Kale stood near the workbench immediately once Elias entered. "We worked. Not proud. Careful." Like proving usefulness mattered before the carpenter changed his mind about letting them stay. God. Elias set the supply sacks down slowly. "Your children." Kale's expression hardened instantly. "No." One word. Still enough, hollowing the room completely. The carpenter studied him quietly afterward. Because suddenly he understood. The boy stopped seeing himself as child long ago. Probably the same moment survival. became his responsibility instead of someone else's. That night, Elias deliberately stayed awake longer. And just after midnight, he heard movement downstairs again. The carpenter looked silently from the staircase. Cale sat beside the front door once more, axe across his lap, watching, always watching. Interesting thing about traumatized people. Safe places exhausted them because relaxing felt dangerous. Elias descended slowly toward him. You expecting someone? Cale didn't answer immediately. Then finally, without looking away from the dark windows, he whispered, people always come back eventually. God above. The sentence settled cold and painful through the warm little workshop. Not fear. Experience. The carpenter looked toward the 16-year-old orc boy sitting guard beside the door instead of sleeping because somewhere in his short, brutal life, danger arrived so often he no longer believed safety lasted through the night. The rumors started before the snow even melted. Interesting thing about small villages. People notice strangers faster than storms. By the end of the week, nearly everyone in Hollow Creek knew Elias Turner sheltered two young orc brothers inside his workshop. And naturally, fear spread faster than truth ever could. Some villagers simply stared whenever Cale walked beside Elias carrying lumber through town. Others crossed streets entirely after noticing Milo's green skin and pointed ears beneath oversized winter scarves. Children whispered openly. Adults pretended not to. God above. Elias already hated all of them. The brothers noticed too. Of course they did. Traumatized kids always notice danger first. One cold morning, Elias brought Cale into the village market, helping deliver repaired furniture to the innkeeper before spring trading season began. The older boy stayed silent the entire walk. Not shy, watchful. Every time someone looked at them too long, Cale subtly stepped between Elias and nearby crowds automatically, like he expected violence appearing from nowhere. Interesting. Even kindness hadn't convinced him lowering defenses safely yet. The carpenter set down the repaired chair near the market square, while townspeople moved carefully around them, pretending not staring. Then old Bram spoke too loudly from beside the butcher stall. Bringing orcs into town now. Wonderful. Cale immediately stiffened beside the wagon. Elias kept unloading furniture calmly. Morning to you too. The butcher snorted. You trust them things around decent people? There it was. Things. God. The carpenter felt anger settle steadily through his chest. Cale lowered his gaze toward the muddy street instantly. Not surprised. Recognition. Like he heard this garbage everywhere already. They're children, Elias answered flatly. Today, Bram crossed thick arms across his chest. Then they grow into problems. Interesting thing about prejudice. Cowards always spoke about kids like future monsters instead of current victims. Several villagers nearby nodded uneasily. God above. Cale quietly reached for the wagon handles beside him. We should go. The sentence nearly broke something inside Elias. Not fear for himself. The boy simply expected rejection eventually and wanted leaving before things got worse. The carpenter turned slowly toward Bram. Funny thing about problems. His voice stayed calm. Most I've met were fully human. Silence crashed through the market square. Sharp enough cutting skin. A few villagers looked away immediately afterward. Good. Still, damage done. Cale remained tense the entire walk home afterward. And Milo looked even worse. The younger child froze completely once Elias and Cale returned to the workshop carrying supplies from town. What happened? Milo whispered. Interesting. Not how was town. Fear first. Always fear first. Nothing. Cale answered too quickly. Lie. Milo noticed immediately. The younger boy stared toward the bread sacks silently afterward before asking the question, hollowing the room completely. Do we need leaving? God above. The child asked it like asking about weather. Normal. Expected. Elias set the supply crates down harder than intended. No. Both brothers froze. The carpenter crossed his arms slowly. You're not being thrown out because idiots in town fear children. Cale looked unconvinced. Interesting thing about abused people. Consistency mattered more than promises. That evening things worsened. Someone threw rocks through the workshop windows after dark. Glass shattered loudly across the floor, while Milo screamed instinctively near the furnace before immediately covering his mouth afterward like he regretted making noise. God. Cale grabbed the wood axe beside the workbench instantly, pulling his younger brother behind him. Protective. Always protective. Elias stormed outside into the freezing night, expecting catching whoever did it. Too late. Only empty snowy streets remained beneath lantern light. Cowards. The carpenter returned inside, muttering curses beneath his breath, while cold air drifted through the broken windows. Milo still trembled beside the furnace. Interesting. Not because of broken glass. Because attacks arriving after dark clearly felt familiar. Kale immediately started cleaning shattered pieces from the floor without being asked. Like damage automatically became their responsibility. Jesus. Elias crouched beside the younger child carefully. Nobody's hurting you here. Milo looked uncertain. Then quietly. They usually get worse after this. The sentence settled heavy inside the workshop. Not fear. Experience again. God above. The carpenter suddenly realized these boys probably spent years watching hatred escalate step by step before violence finally followed. Elias stood slowly afterward before crossing toward the front door. Kale looked up sharply. Where are you going? Town meeting. Interesting. The older boy immediately looked alarmed instead of relieved. Like adults confronting problems usually created bigger ones later. The carpenter grabbed his coat anyway. People around here need reminding fear doesn't make them righteous. Kale stared at him silently afterward. Then softly, almost disbelieving, he asked, Why do you care so much? God above. The question hollowed the room completely. Because the boy sounded genuinely confused. Like kindness this persistent made no sense after the life he survived. Elias looked toward the two frightened orc brothers standing inside his warm little workshop, while snowstorms softened outside and broken glass glittered across the floor beneath lantern light. Then quietly answered, Because somebody should have cared sooner. Elias discovered the hidden bread completely by accident. The carpenter spent most of the morning repairing damaged window frames after villagers shattered the workshop glass 2 nights earlier. Spring winds still slipped cold through the cracks, while Kale worked silently beside him, sanding replacement boards smooth enough fitting properly. Interesting thing about the older brother. He never stayed still long. If Elias carried lumber, Kale grabbed the heavier side first. If tools needed organizing, the boy already finished before being asked. Every movement carried the same desperate energy, like usefulness guaranteed survival somehow. God above. The carpenter hated recognizing that instinct. Meanwhile, Milo stayed near the furnace sketching little charcoal drawings on a scrap with pieces Elias usually discarded after projects. Small things. Birds. Trees. A terrible drawing of Kale holding an axe larger than his entire body. Interesting. The younger child only drew safe things. Around midday, Elias finally called both boys toward the kitchen table for lunch. Fresh bread. Stew. Warm tea. Simple meal. Still enough, making Milo stare like someone laid treasure across the table. Kale immediately pushed half his bread toward the younger child first without thinking. Automatic. Protective. Always protective. Milo eats his own portion, Elias muttered flatly. The older boy stiffened slightly, then carefully moved the bread back. Interesting thing about starving siblings. Older ones often forgot feeding themselves mattered too. Lunch passed quietly afterward except for occasional rain tapping softly against workshop windows. Then Elias noticed something strange. Milo wasn't eating all his bread. The younger child kept glancing nervously toward his oversized sleeves instead. God above. The carpenter pretended not noticing at first. Until later that evening while sweeping sawdust near the furnace, he discovered hardened bread crusts hidden carefully beneath loose floorboards beside Milo's cot. Several pieces. Old and new. Cold realization settled immediately into his chest. Interesting. The child thought food might disappear again. Elias looked toward Milo silently across the workshop. The younger boy froze the moment he realized the carpenter found the hidden bread. Panic flooded his face instantly. Not guilt. Fear. God. Milo backed away from the furnace so quickly he nearly tripped over stacked firewood. Sorry, he whispered immediately. There it was again. Always apologies first. The carpenter crouched beside the floorboards quietly, holding the stale bread pieces. You hiding food? Milo stared toward the ground, trembling slightly. Like this question already ended badly before. Kale noticed the scene instantly from the workbench nearby and crossed the room fast enough, making Elias understand immediately. The older brother expected punishment coming. Protective instinct exploded through him automatically. He didn't steal anything, Kale said quickly. Interesting. Not denial. Defense. The carpenter looked between both boys silently. God above. They genuinely believed hidden bread might get them thrown out. Elias sighed softly before setting the crusts, carefully back beside the cot instead of taking them away. The brothers froze. Confusion now. Milo blinked once. You're not angry? The sentence nearly broke something inside the carpenter's chest, because the child sounded genuinely shocked. Elias sat slowly on the edge of the nearby workbench. How long'd you go hungry before getting here? Silence crashed through the workshop. Heavy silence. Kale's jaw tightened visibly. Then quietly. Sometimes days. God. Milo wrapped both arms tightly around himself near the furnace. People locked food storage after dark at the labor camps. The younger child whispered shakily. If workers stole, his voice trailed off immediately. Interesting thing about traumatized kids. They stopped stories right before the worst parts instinctively. Elias already hated those camps without hearing another word. Kale crossed closer toward Milo, afterward subtly placing himself between the younger child and the rest of the workshop again. Protective. Always protective. The carpenter studied the hidden bread crusts quietly beside the cot, then looked toward Milo carefully. You know there'll be breakfast tomorrow, right? Silence. The younger child looked uncertain. Not because he doubted Elias specifically, because hunger lasting long enough rewired belief itself. God above. Elias stood slowly before crossing toward the kitchen shelves. A moment later, he returned carrying an old wooden box once used storing carving tools years earlier. The carpenter set it gently beside Milo's cot. What's this? Kale asked cautiously. Food box. Both brothers stared at him silently. Interesting. Like the idea confused them entirely. Elias crossed his arms. If either of you get scared, there won't be enough later. Put bread in there instead of hiding it under floorboards where rats will eat it first. Milo looked toward the box like it might vanish any second. Then softly, we can keep it. God. The carpenter felt something heavy twist painfully through his chest again. Children shouldn't sound shocked by permission eating later. Yes, Elias answered quietly. You can keep it. The younger boy's eyes filled instantly with tears he clearly tried hiding. Kale looked away toward the workshop windows, pretending not noticing. Still protective. Still carrying too much responsibility for someone barely 16. And watching the frightened little orc child carefully place one piece of bread inside the wooden box like storing treasure worth more than gold, Elias Turner realized one heartbreaking truth completely. Milo didn't hide food because he was greedy. He hid it because somewhere in his short, brutal life, hunger taught him kindness never lasted longer than the next meal. Elias discovered the scars during the first warm day of spring. Snow finally melted from the mountain roads surrounding Hollow Creek, while sunlight spilled through the workshop windows bright enough, warming the old wooden floors for the first time in months. And somehow, the brothers looked different in sunlight. Healthier. Milo laughed more now. Sometimes the younger boy even followed Elias through the workshop, asking endless questions about carving tools and furniture joints, while carrying little bundles of nails far too proudly for someone his size. Kale changed slower. Interesting thing about older siblings. They usually healed last. The 16-year-old still woke before dawn every morning, checking doors and windows before anyone else stirred. He still watched strangers too carefully whenever supply wagons passed through town. Even during peaceful moments, tension stayed locked constantly through his shoulders, like his body forgot how relaxing worked anymore. God above. Elias noticed all of it. That afternoon, while repairing fishing nets near the river docks, Kale accidentally split one sleeve of his work shirt, dragging lumber across exposed nails. The carpenter barely looked up from the toolbox nearby. You tore it. Kale froze instantly. Interesting. Not embarrassment. Alarm. Like damaged clothes carried consequences once. It's fine. The older boy muttered quickly while tugging the sleeve downward again. Lie. The tear stretched nearly shoulder to elbow. Elias sighed softly. Come inside. Mrs. Talbot can stitch it before you freeze wearing holes next winter. Kale immediately shook his head. Don't need it. Wonderful. The carpenter crossed his arms slowly. That wasn't a question. Inside the workshop later, Milo sat near the furnace carving tiny wooden animals from scrap pieces while Elias searched storage drawers for sewing supplies. Kale lingered awkwardly near the doorway, clearly prepared, bolting outside if necessary. Interesting. The boy looked more nervous about mending clothes than facing angry villagers. God above. Elias finally found the sewing kit and tossed it toward him. Take the shirt off. Everything stopped. Cale physically went still. Not discomfort. Fear. The carpenter noticed immediately. Milo noticed too. The younger child lowered the wooden carving silently, while worry flooded his expression. Cale. The older brother forced a shrug. It's nothing. Another lie. Elias leaned against the workbench quietly. Kid, I've built coffins. I know what nothing looks like. Silence stretched heavily through the workshop. Then very slowly, like every movement hurt, Cale pulled the torn shirt over his head and got above. The carpenter stopped breathing for one horrible second. Scars. Whip scars. Dozens of them. Old and new marks crossed the older boy's back from shoulders to waist beneath pale green skin, carved so brutally it barely looked real anymore. Some healed thick and uneven while others still carried angry red edges, not fully faded yet. Jesus Christ. Milo looked away immediately. Interesting. Not surprise. Recognition. Like he already memorized every scar there. Cale stood stiffly near the workshop wall, refusing turning around fully while shame and tension radiated through every inch of him. Labor overseers used iron cords, the older boy muttered flatly. Healed ugly. The calmness inside his voice made Elias physically sick. Like pain this severe became ordinary long ago. The carpenter stared silently at the scars while cold fury settled deeper and deeper inside his chest. Not loud anger. The kind making violence understandable. How old were you? Cale froze. Then quietly. First time? 9 maybe. Got above. Milo suddenly climbed down from the furnace bench and crossed the room fast enough, nearly tripping over himself before wrapping both arms tightly around his brother's waist from behind. Protective too. Interesting. The younger child held Cale like he could somehow shield him retroactively from things already survived. Elias looked away briefly because something inside his chest hurt suddenly. Children shouldn't know comforting each other for torture this young. Cale gently rested one hand over Milo's smaller ones without speaking. Then after a long silence, the older boy muttered. Usually happened if workers slowed down. The carpenter forced himself asking the question anyway. And children counted as workers? Cale barked out one short humorless laugh. There weren't children there. God. The sentence hollowed the workshop completely. Not bitterness. Fact. Like childhood simply stopped existing once labor camps owned you. Elias grabbed the sewing kit harder than necessary before sitting heavily near the workbench. Turn around, he muttered quietly. Cale hesitated visibly, then obeyed. Interesting. Not because he trusted adults easily now. Because somewhere along the way Elias became safe enough risking vulnerability around. The carpenter carefully stitched the torn sleeve while warm sunlight drifted across the workshop, and Milo remained glued to his brother's side the entire time, like letting go might somehow cause more pain appearing. Then softly Elias asked, "Why'd they target you so much?" Cale stared toward the floorboards silently for several long seconds. Finally, barely above a whisper, he answered, "Because I fought back whenever they touched Milo." Silence crashed through the workshop. Heavy enough, barely breathing through. Got above. The carpenter suddenly understood everything. The sleepless nights. The constant guarding. The way Cale watched every room first before letting Milo enter safely afterward. The boy wasn't paranoid. He was surviving. And staring at the scarred 16-year-old child who endured years of beatings simply because protecting his little brother mattered more than his own safety, Elias Turner realized one heartbreaking truth completely. Cale gave up being a child the moment the world threatened Milo first. The confession came during a thunderstorm. Rain hammered against the workshop roof while spring lightning flashed across Hollow Creek hard enough, illuminating the windows white every few seconds. Most villagers stayed indoors that night, leaving the streets outside silent except for storm winds and distant thunder rolling through the mountains. Inside the workshop, warmth filled the little building softly. Milo slept curled near the furnace beneath thick blankets while Elias repaired cabinet hinges beside the workbench under lantern light. Cale remained awake. Of course he did. Interesting thing about older brothers carrying too much responsibility. Sleep became something they earned only after everyone else survived the night first. The carpenter noticed the boy sitting beside the front door again, axe resting across his knees exactly like every other sleepless night since arriving months earlier. Got above. Some habits rooted too deep disappearing quickly. Another thunderclap shook the windows. Milo stirred immediately in his sleep with a frightened sound before settling again once Kale glanced toward him. Protective. Always protective. Elias finally set the tools aside. You know lightning's not personally attacking the workshop, right? For one brief second, Kale almost smiled. Almost. Then the expression vanished again. Interesting. The boy still looked guilty whenever happiness slipped out accidentally. The carpenter leaned back against the workbench quietly. You ever planning resting properly? Kale shrugged without looking away from the dark windows. Milo sleeps easier if I stay awake. God. The simple honesty inside those words hollowed the room somehow. Elias crossed slowly toward the furnace, adding another log to the fire before speaking again. You've been protecting him alone a long time. Silence stretched between thunderclaps. Then finally, quiet enough, nearly losing it beneath the storm. Kale answered, since our mother died. The carpenter stayed still, listening. Because someone should. Kale's fingers tightened slightly around the axe handle resting across his lap. She got sick during winter transport. Another pause. Camp healers said medicine cost extra. Jesus Christ. The boy spoke about cruelty too calmly again. Like survival forced him memorizing pain instead of processing it. Milo was 5. Kale stared toward the furnace where his little brother slept peacefully now. Didn't understand what was happening. God above. The older boy swallowed hard before continuing. Our mother kept apologizing. His voice roughened slightly. Even dying, she apologized because she couldn't protect us anymore. Silence crashed heavily through the workshop. Rain, thunder, fire crackling softly. Everything else disappeared. Then Kale whispered, she made me promise. Elias already knew the answer somehow. Still hurt hearing it. The older boy finally looked toward the sleeping child near the furnace. She grabbed my arm before the overseers dragged her away. Another pause. Told me keeping Milo alive mattered more than anything. God. Kale laughed once softly afterward. Broken sound. I was 12. The sentence nearly shattered the carpenter completely. 12. Not old enough carrying another child through labor camps and winter roads and starvation. Not old enough surviving this much grief already. Kale stared down toward the axe across his knees while lightning flickered across the workshop again. I couldn't save her, he whispered. So I saved him instead. Interesting thing about traumatized kids. They often turned impossible choices into personal failures. Elias felt anger twisting deep inside his chest. Not toward Kale. Toward every adult who forced children making promises like that in the first place. The older boy rubbed tiredly at one eye quickly before emotion fully escaped. Interesting. Like crying still embarrassed him somehow. Sometimes I think she knew I'd survive longer than she would. Another pause. That's why she asked me instead of anyone else. The carpenter looked toward the 16-year-old sitting guard beside the workshop door through storms and sleepless nights, because somewhere along the road, he convinced himself resting counted betrayal. God above. No child should carry responsibility this heavy. Thunder cracked violently overhead then. Milo woke instantly afterward, breathing hard from panic before his eyes even fully opened. Kale moved immediately. Fast. Protective instinct exploding through him before conscious thought. I'm here, the older brother whispered while kneeling beside the cot. You're all right. Interesting. Milo calmed almost instantly hearing his voice. Not because the storm ended. Because Kale stayed beside him. The younger child reached sleepily toward his brother's sleeve before drifting back beneath the blankets moments later. Simple movement. Still enough breaking Elias' heart somehow. Kale remained kneeling beside the cot afterward, gently brushing wet hair from Milo's forehead while thunderstorms rolled across the village outside. Then quietly, without looking up, the older boy admitted, if anything happened to him, his voice cracked slightly, I wouldn't know who I'm supposed to be anymore. God. The carpenter looked toward the frightened, exhausted child who built his entire identity around protecting one smaller boy because grief and survival stole everything else from him years ago. Then softly Elias answered, you're allowed being more than someone carrying pain for other people. Kale went still. Interesting. Like nobody ever suggested that possibility before. The workshop stayed warm around them while storms faded slowly beyond the windows outside. And watching the scarred 16-year-old who sacrificed childhood itself, keeping his little brother alive through cruelty no child should survive, Elias Turner realized one heartbreaking truth completely. Kale didn't fear dying most. He feared failing the promise made beside his mother's deathbed years ago. The hunters entered Hollow Creek at sunrise. Elias noticed them immediately. 3 mounted riders crossed the village bridge beneath gray morning skies, while muddy spring roads splashed beneath heavy horses and nervous townspeople quietly stepped aside, watching them pass. Interesting thing about dangerous men. They carried authority like weapons. These men especially. Dark leather coats. Iron badges burned into saddle straps. Crossbows hanging beside polished blades too clean belonging to honest workers. Not merchants. Trackers. God above. Inside the workshop, Kale saw them through the front window 1 second later, and instantly went pale. The wooden crate slipped from his hands, crashing hard against the floorboards. Milo startled beside the furnace. Kale. The older brother didn't answer. Interesting. Not fear exactly. Recognition. Kale crossed the workshop fast enough, reaching the curtains before Elias even turned toward the street outside, then immediately pulled Milo behind him. Protective. Always protective. God. The carpenter looked through the half-covered window and felt cold dread settle heavily inside his chest. One rider held rolled parchment papers, already questioning villagers near the market square. Descriptions. Wonderful. Kale's breathing turned sharp and uneven behind him. They found us. The sentence came out flat. Exhausted, like part of him always expected this day eventually arriving. Milo grabbed desperately at his brother's sleeve. We can leave now. Jesus. The younger child said it automatically. Not panic. Routine. Like running became survival instinct long ago. Elias locked the workshop door carefully before turning back toward them. No one's going anywhere. Kale looked almost angry hearing that. Interesting. Not because he distrusted Elias anymore. Because staying meant danger reaching someone else now. They're labor hunters, the older boy muttered quickly. They'll arrest you for hiding us. The carpenter crossed his arms slowly. Good thing I'm already difficult. Nobody smiled. God above. Outside, one of the riders pointed directly toward the workshop. Too late. They already knew. Kale immediately grabbed the wood axe near the furnace while positioning himself in front of Milo automatically. 16 years old. Already preparing die for his little brother without hesitation. Something inside Elias hardened coldly then. No child should stand like that. A heavy knock thundered against the workshop door moments later. Then another. Open up. Milo physically flinched. Not small fear. Pure terror. God. The younger child looked seconds away from bolting upstairs and hiding beneath floorboards again. Kale tightened one hand around the axe handle. Stay behind me. Interesting thing about trauma. Kids often mistook self-sacrifice for bravery because nobody taught them alternatives. The knocking came harder. We're searching for runaway labor property. Wrong word. Immediately wrong word. Elias felt anger settle deep inside his chest. Property. Jesus Christ. The carpenter stepped toward the door while Kale grabbed his arm suddenly. Don't. Elias looked back. The older boy's expression carried something heartbreaking now. Guilt. They'll hurt you too. God above. Even terrified, the child worried about someone else first. The carpenter rested one rough hand briefly against Kale's shoulder. I've survived worse than bureaucrats with horses. Then he opened the door. 3 men waited outside beneath cold morning rain. The oldest smiled thinly once noticing Elias. Morning. His eyes swept casually through the workshop behind him before landing on Kale and Milo instantly. There they are. Milo shrank against his brother immediately. The hunter pulled folded papers from his coat, revealing rough charcoal sketches unmistakably matching both boys. Runaway labor assets belonging to Iron Hollow Mining Authority. Assets. God. Elias blocked the doorway fully. Those are children. The second rider snorted softly. Children don't owe 6 years' labor debt. Kale physically froze behind the carpenter. Interesting. Not surprise. Shame. Like someone convinced him debt justified abuse long enough. The oldest hunter lowered his voice slightly. Look, Carpenter. Return the boys quietly, and nobody gets fined for interference. Milo started trembling visibly now. The younger child buried both hands against Kale's torn sleeve like trying to disappear entirely. Elias looked toward the hunters calmly, then asked, What happens if I refuse? Silence stretched. The riders exchanged quick looks. Finally, the oldest answered coldly. Then we remind the village harboring escaped property carries consequences. Wrong choice. Wrong sentence entirely. Because something dangerous settled fully into Elias Turner's chest then. Choice. The carpenter stepped forward into the rain slightly. They're not property. The hunter's expression hardened instantly. Move aside. No. Simple word. Still enough changing everything. Cale stared at Elias silently behind him. Interesting thing about abused kids. They never expected adults staying once danger appeared. The oldest hunter rested one hand near his crossbow slowly. You willing risking your workshop over orc runaways? Elias glanced briefly toward the frightened brothers behind him before answering. No. Then colder. I'm risking it because grown men hunting children should be ashamed of themselves. Silence crashed across the rainy street. Sharp enough cutting skin. Even nearby villagers watching nervously from windows went still afterward. And standing between armed labor hunters and the two frightened orc brothers who spent years running from people calling them property, Elias Turner realized one undeniable truth completely. Whatever happened next, he was never letting those boys go back alive. The hunters stayed in Hollow Creek for 4 more days. For long days of tension thick enough poisoning the entire village. They questioned merchants, searched supply roads, offered coin rewards for information about the runaway workers hiding somewhere nearby. Interesting thing about cruel men. They always sounded calmest while discussing terrible things. Elias refused letting the brothers leave the workshop alone during any of it. Not because Cale feared for himself. Because the older boy looked ready sacrificing everything if the hunters got close to Milo again. God above. The carpenter watched that instinct constantly now. Cale slept even less. Ate only after forcing Milo finishing meals first. Every sound outside the workshop at night still sent his hand toward the axe beside the furnace automatically. Meanwhile, Milo became quieter. Not frightened exactly. Worse. Hopeful children falling silent again always hurt more. The younger boy stopped drawing beside the furnace. Stopped asking questions about woodworking. Sometimes Elias caught him secretly packing tiny bundles of bread back into the old food box, like preparing for another escape already. God. One rainy afternoon, after the hunters rode toward the southern road searching nearby farms, Elias finally found Milo sitting alone behind the workshop staring toward the river. The little boy looked painfully small beneath oversized clothes and muddy spring skies. Interesting thing about children carrying fear too long. They often mistook leaving first for protecting people they loved. The carpenter sat beside him quietly on the old wooden fence. For several minutes, neither spoke. Then softly Elias asked, "You planning running?" Milo froze instantly. Caught. The younger child stared down toward his boots afterward while small fingers twisted nervously together in his lap. "We make trouble wherever we go," he whispered. God above. The sentence nearly hollowed the cold afternoon air completely. Not bitterness. Simple, exhausted belief. Like every terrible thing adults said about them slowly became truth inside his head. Elias leaned forward, resting both forearms against his knees. "You know what I think?" Milo glanced toward him uncertainly. "I think 2 scared kids survive things most grown men couldn't." Another pause. And somehow stayed kind afterward anyway. Silence stretched beside the river. Wind moved softly through wet trees nearby, while distant thunder rolled across the mountains again. Then Milo whispered, "Cale says kindness gets people hurt." Interesting. The carpenter nodded slowly. Probably true sometimes. The little boy looked confused, hearing agreement instead of correction. Elias continued gently. "But cruelty hurts people every single time." God. Milo stared toward the river again, afterward quietly thinking. Then suddenly, Cale used to smile more. The sentence hurt hearing. The younger child pulled his knees closer against his chest while rain dripped steadily from the workshop roof behind them. Before the camps. Another pause. Before Mom died. Jesus. Elias stayed silent. Listening. Because someone should. He told jokes. Milo whispered softly. Bad ones. For one brief second, a tiny smile touched the child's face. Really bad ones. Interesting. There it was. Memory surviving beneath fear. The carpenter smiled faintly too. Sounds tragic. Milo huffed one quiet laugh accidentally. Small sound. Still enough feeling miraculous. God above. The younger child looked shocked immediately afterward, like he forgot laughter still belonged to him too. Then slowly, carefully, he smiled again. Real smile this time. Warm. Young. Human. The sight nearly broke Elias completely. because suddenly he could finally see the little boy hidden beneath all the fear and hunger and survival instincts. Just a child. Nothing more. Nothing less. Interesting thing about healing. Sometimes it arrived through tiny moments people almost missed. Milo picked up a smooth stone from beside the riverbank afterward before asking quietly, "You really don't want us leaving?" God. The uncertainty inside those words hurt worse than tears somehow. Elias looked directly toward the frightened little orc boy sitting beside him beneath gray spring skies, then answered honestly, "No." Milo swallowed hard afterward while emotions crossed his face too fast naming properly. Disbelief. Relief. Grief maybe. Then finally the younger child whispered, "No one's ever said that before." The carpenter felt something heavy twist painfully through his chest. Children shouldn't sound shocked by being wanted. That evening, Elias returned to the workshop with Milo trailing beside him, carrying river stones proudly in both pockets like treasure. Inside, Kale immediately stood from the workbench the moment they entered. Panic flashed across his face first. Always fear first. Then relief softened his shoulders once he saw Milo safe beside Elias. Interesting. The older brother checked Milo for injuries with his eyes automatically before relaxing fully. Protective. Always protective. Milo suddenly reached into one pocket and tossed a smooth river stone toward Kale. The older boy blinked once, catching it awkwardly. "What's this?" Milo grinned slightly. "Payment for terrible jokes." For one brief second, Kale laughed. Real laugh. Quiet and rusty from disuse. Still enough stopping Elias cold. Because suddenly the workshop sounded less haunted. Warmer somehow. And watching the two frightened orc brothers smile beside the furnace for the first time since arriving in Hollow Creek, Elias Turner realized one extraordinary truth completely. The boys weren't slowly becoming less broken. They were finally becoming children again. The hunters returned at dawn with more men. Elias saw them crossing the bridge before the village bells even finished ringing. 6 riders this time. Armed. God above. Rain clouds rolled low across Hollow Creek while nervous villagers peeked through curtains and half-open doors watching the mounted men move toward the carpenter's workshop with cold, deliberate purpose. Interesting thing about people hunting children. They always arrived pretending legality made cruelty respectable. Inside the workshop, Kale noticed the riders 1 second later through the front window and immediately reached for the axe beside the furnace. Not hesitation. Instinct. Milo froze near the kitchen table while fear drained every trace of warmth from his face. "They found us," the younger child whispered. Kale crossed the room instantly, pulling Milo behind him. Protective. Always protective. God. Elias locked the workshop door carefully before turning toward them. "No one's taking you." The older brother looked furious hearing that. Interesting. Not because he doubted Elias anymore. Because staying meant someone else getting hurt for them again. "There's too many," Kale muttered tightly. "We can run through the back roads before." "No." Simple word. Still enough stopping the room completely. The carpenter stepped between the boys and the front entrance while heavy knocks already thundered against the workshop door outside. "Open up." Milo physically flinched. "Jesus." The younger child looked 8 again suddenly instead of brave. Kale tightened his grip around the axe harder. "They'll kill you for interfering." Elias crossed his arms slowly. "Then they'll work for it." God above. The older boy stared at him silently afterward. Like adults, choosing danger voluntarily still made no sense. Another violent knock shook the workshop walls. "We know the runaways are inside." Runaways. Property. Assets. Interesting how cruel men always invented words avoiding children. The carpenter finally opened the door halfway. Rain blasted cold air immediately into the warm workshop. 6 hunters waited outside beneath dark morning skies. The oldest smiled thinly once, spotting Elias. "You've complicated this unnecessarily." Elias leaned one shoulder against the doorway calmly. "Funny. I was thinking the same thing." The second hunter glanced past him toward Kale and Milo inside the workshop. There they are. Milo instinctively buried himself against his brother's side. God. The oldest rider pulled folded documents from his coat. "By authority of Iron Hollow Mining Consortium, those boys belong to contracted labor ownership until debts are fulfilled." Kale physically lowered his head hearing it. Shame. Still shame after everything. Jesus Christ. Elias looked toward the papers briefly, then back toward the hunters. Their children. Their investments. Wrong word. Immediately wrong word. Because something dangerous settled cold and final inside the carpenter's chest then. Choice. Elias stepped fully outside into the rain before pulling the workshop door shut behind him. Interesting. He didn't want the boys hearing this part. The hunters looked surprised briefly. Good. The carpenter crossed his arms. Let me explain something clearly. Rain dripped steadily from his coat, while thunder rolled softly above the village rooftops. If any of you step inside that workshop, you'll regret it. The oldest rider laughed once sharply. One carpenter against 6 armed men? Depends. Elias glanced toward the nearby woodpile casually. You counting intelligence too? Several hunters visibly stiffened. Interesting. They expected fear, not resistance. The second rider spat into the mud. Move aside, old man. No. Simple again. Still enough, sharpening the entire street. Behind nearby windows, villagers watched silently now. The whole town knew. The oldest hunter's expression darkened. You understand harboring escaped labor carries prison sentences? Elias shrugged once. Probably healthier than mining camps. God above. That landed. One younger hunter actually looked uncomfortable afterward. Good. The oldest stepped closer, lowering his voice. You're risking your life for orcs. Wrong sentence. Wrong choice entirely. Because Elias looked directly into the man's eyes before answering quietly. No. Then colder. I'm risking it for children you monsters treated like animals. Silence crashed through the rainy street. Heavy enough, cutting skin. The hunter's hand drifted slowly toward his sword. Inside the workshop, something slammed loudly against the door. Kale. The older boy was coming out. Wonderful. Before Elias could stop him, the workshop door burst open behind him. Kale stepped into the rain, gripping the axe tightly, while Milo clung terrified behind his back beneath oversized coats. Interesting thing about traumatized kids. Eventually, they stopped letting adults fight alone. You want someone, Kale said flatly. Take me. God above. The sentence hollowed the street completely. Milo grabbed desperately at his brother's sleeve. No. The older boy never looked back toward him. Protective. Always protective. The oldest hunter smiled faintly. Smart decision. Wrong again. Because Elias immediately stepped sideways, blocking the hunter's view of both boys completely. No deals. Kale stared at him in shock. Interesting. Like nobody ever refused sacrificing him before. The carpenter's voice turned deadly calm. You don't get either of them. Rain hammered against rooftops while silence swallowed Hollow Creek entirely. And standing between armed hunters and the 2 frightened orc brothers who spent their whole lives believing people eventually traded them away once survival became inconvenient, Elias Turner realized one undeniable truth completely. He already loved those boys enough, risking everything for them. Winter returned to Hollow Creek quietly. Snow drifted across the village rooftops again, while warm lantern light glowed through frosted windows, and smoke curled lazily into pale evening skies above the mountains. But this winter felt different. Safer somehow. The hunters never returned after the confrontation outside Elias' workshop months earlier. Rumors spread eventually through nearby towns about investigations into the Iron Hollow labor camps. Missing children. Dead workers. Illegal debt contracts. Several overseers vanished before authorities reached the mines at all. Interesting thing about cruel men. They ran quickly once the world finally started looking at them properly. Elias cared very little about the politics afterward. Because Kale slept through the night now. God above, the first time it happened nearly broke the carpenter completely. The older boy accidentally fell asleep beside the workshop furnace one snowy evening after finishing repairs on dining chairs for the innkeeper. No axe across his lap. No waking every hour checking locks. Just sleep. Real sleep. Elias noticed it immediately because Kale's face looked younger, resting. Not 16, carrying half a lifetime of fear already. Just a tired kid. Meanwhile, Milo transformed entirely. The younger boy filled the workshop with noise now. Constant questions, terrible singing, and endless chatter while following Elias around carrying tools twice too large for him. Interesting thing about healing children. They became loud once they stopped fearing punishment for existing. One morning, Milo proudly nailed an entire cabinet door completely sideways before announcing it looked creative. Kale laughed so hard he nearly dropped a lumber crate. Real laughter. Warm laughter. God above. The sound changed the workshop somehow. Months ago, silence haunted the little building constantly. Now it felt alive. The village changed too. Slowly, awkwardly, but genuinely. Old Bram from the butcher stall eventually started slipping extra meat bones into Milo's soup bundles by accident. Mrs. Talbot knitted both brothers' winter scarves thick enough surviving mountain storms. Even the innkeeper stopped calling them orc boys and started using their actual names instead. Progress. Beautiful progress. Interesting thing about kindness. Sometimes people learned it late. Still mattered. One snowy evening near the first winter festival, Elias returned from town carrying supply sacks only to stop completely outside the workshop door. Voices drifted from inside. Kale and Milo arguing. The carpenter smiled immediately, because arguing meant comfort now, not fear. Inside, the younger boy stood atop a stool decorating the workshop tree with badly carved wooden stars, while Kale untangled lantern strings nearby, looking deeply exhausted by the entire process. "You put 6 decorations on one branch," Kale muttered. "It's festive. It's collapsing. It has personality." "God above." Elias barked out a laugh, entering the workshop before either noticed him. Milo immediately pointed accusingly toward his brother. "Kale's attacking art again." The older boy rolled his eyes dramatically. "Kale's trying preventing fire hazards." "Interesting." The boy referred to himself normally, now sometimes instead of only existing as protector first. "Healing. Slow, beautiful healing." The carpenter set supply sacks beside the furnace while warm firelight flickered across the cozy workshop around them. Snow fell softly beyond the windows outside. Home. The realization hit Elias suddenly and hard. Not workshop. Not shelter. Home. Kale looked toward him quietly then. Interesting expression. Nervous almost. The older boy rubbed awkwardly at the back of his neck before speaking. He glanced briefly toward Milo first. "Wanted asking something." Milo immediately grinned. "God above." That expression usually meant trouble. Elias crossed his arms slowly. "Concerning already." The younger child jumped down from the stool, carrying something hidden behind his back, before holding it proudly toward the carpenter. A wooden sign. Hand-carved. Crooked. Beautiful anyway. Elias Turner and Sons Workshop. Silence crashed softly through the warm little building. "God." The carpenter stared at the sign, while something painful and warm twisted inside his chest simultaneously. Interesting thing about lonely people. They often forgot how badly they wanted family until it suddenly stood right in front of them. Kale looked terrified suddenly, like the sign crossed boundaries somehow. "We can change it," the older boy said quickly. Milo just thought maybe. "No." Both brothers froze instantly. "God above." Milo looked seconds away, apologizing for existing again. Then Elias carefully took the sign into his rough, weathered hands before speaking softer. "No changes." Silence. Then Milo smiled first, bright enough warming the entire workshop. Kale followed slower, still cautious with happiness sometimes. Still healing. The carpenter hung the sign above the workshop doorway that night, while snowstorms drifted softly through Hollow Creek outside, and warm lantern light glowed across the village below. And standing there beside the 2 frightened orc brothers who once arrived starving in the snow, believing work was the only reason anyone might keep them around, Elias Turner realized one extraordinary truth completely. The boys didn't just survive long enough finding safety. They finally found the first place in the world they were loved without earning it first.